everyone. Um, this is Steve Polgar uh, with Citizen Speaks, and I haven't done one of these broadcasts in a while. Been busy with other things, and I thought taking a break from this won't hurt anyway. Um, so please, if you will, click the like button, and even better yet, subscribe. That will encourage me to do more of these, uh, hopefully a little bit more often too. Uh, Today we're going to talk about something a little bit different than the other topics, although in some sense this is also political because actually it sort of goes beyond philosophical and political in some ways, or combines the two, let's put it that way. Okay, so let's begin. Again, it's a Citizen Speaks, and please, if you will, click the like button. The topic today is morality of words. John's book of the New Testament starts, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. That is one of the incredible statements of Christianity inherited from the Jews. It is a statement misunderstood and misrepresented by those who reject Christianity, and by extension Judaism, since the two are based in the same moral system. Christian belief in the role of Christ as the Son of God, who made the ultimate sacrifice of appearing as man and then allowing himself to be crucified to save man, does not reject the moral tenets of Judaism. It adds the gift of which only God was capable. Nothing in the New Testament is a rejection of the Old or of the history and tradition of Judaism. John's statement is the absolute acceptance of the Old Testament, which to the Jews was the Word of God, as revealed through his prophets, and identifies Christ with the Word. We arrive at the absurd contradiction handed down to us from the 19th century. Rejecting God, we have rejected the morality of words. Let us be clear. It is not words describing excrement and copulation or body parts to which morality may be assigned. Those are merely the leftovers of 19th century confusion. Those who were instrumental in appropriating ideas rejecting God and the moral system of Judaism and Christianity based on acceptance of his supremacy were responsible for diminishing the significance of the word, or logos, in John's Greek. They succeeded in doing this, among other things, by pointing to the absurd, false morality of rejecting ancient words like shit, for example, excrement, and even the word fuck, which is in previous ages was applied without moral evaluations, although the act of copulation was banned outside of marriage, and thus the word was not used as commonly as the previous one. Still, even for the ancient Jews and the early Christians, the moral implications of words were not lost. The Jews took their admonition not to use, or more accurately, bear, the name of the Lord in vain to the extent that referring to God with the Hebrew tetragrammaton, that's 4 letters, that's Greek for 4 letters, YHWH, or as we now so inaccurately pronounce, Jehovah, was never written or said. Instead, they spoke of my Lord, Adonai, or used similar descriptions without resorting to those 4 Hebrew letters. Rules for which words may be used and which were prescribed were usually associated with social position or education. In the early years of European Christianity, for example, writing and reading was limited to Latin and the languages of the Germanic, Scandinavian, Slavic, French, Italian, and Spanish people, as well as the other smaller linguistic groups, such as the Celts, Finns, Hungarians, and Basques, and so on. And these were referred to as vulgar, hence the general term describing them as was Vulgate, Vulgate. The first time any of these were written down was in the late 13th century, 13th and early 14th century, Italy, where Dante Alighieri was the most famous writer to champion his native Italian and immortalized it in the Divina Commedia, or Divine Comedy. In English, Geoffrey Chaucer was the first poet to use his native language, which at the time was still a mixture of Anglo-Saxon and French. In his time, and for many years later, those two languages were spoken differently by the people who inhabited England. The mainly Norman French aristocracy and its wealthy, land-owning Anglo-Saxon allies used their version of French among themselves and in their official relations. The Anglo-Saxons, who were the common farm workers, craftsmen, shepherds, or less powerful landowners, used the Anglo-Saxon antecedent of English. As a result, we still have remnants of this division in our modern English. The animals which the Anglo-Saxons tended in the fields or hunted for in the forest have their names, such as cows, bulls, swine, deer. But once they are prepared in the kitchen for eating, they become beef, pork, venison, the names the Norman French used to identify these animals. There are many other examples of Norman French words still used in today's English. But the significance was that a hierarchy was introduced into English. The French, that is Latin-derived words, were considered more refined, implying a refinement based purely on social status. That distinction achieved its most extreme form by the 19th century in England. The aristocracy spoke a language distinct from the lower orders of society. There were many dialects as well, influenced by the peoples in the various parts of Great Britain. The important point was that a knowledgeable Englishman could identify the social status or regional background of the person with whom he was talking. The most famous presentation of these differences was in George Bernard Shaw's play Pygmalion, later made into movies, one of which, a musical from 1967, starred Rex Harrison as Dr. Dolittle, the title character. Though oversimplified, these presentations gave a taste of the myriad difference of English speech in Britain and the English-speaking world. In the 60s, before the film came out, at the home of my uncle and aunt living in the Highgate northern section of London, I had a personal encounter with a lady who spoke a most aristocratic English during tea time. Taken aback with pronunciations and expressions I'd only encountered in parodies, I had the hardest time keeping from bursting out in laughter. After the lady left, my namesake cousin and I had some fun at each other's expense. As an Englishman, he had heard this kind of talk often, while for his American cousin, it was and remains an amusing manifestation of pomposity. After that background, we arrived at our use of words today. Though we are concerned with American English, it is important to note that attitudes towards word usage and acceptance are similar in many other European languages, and may even be so in others. In the last 60 years, the proscriptions which applied once have largely disappeared. In the 50s, children were taught that certain words were inappropriate to use. The most common of these applied to bodily functions, sexual activity, and most importantly, the use of words identified as sacrilegious. Even the words damn or the combination damn it were prohibited. Then the questions of all authority led many to challenge these restrictions. Their argument was that words have no moral value in and of themselves. Though that may be true, what they failed to mention was that associations with words did have moral weight. Thus, damn it is amoral. But since anyone who said it knew one way or another that the word God was left out to mitigate the effect, the expletive had weightier associations. It reached back to the commandment about taking God's name in vain. Though the admonition was more complicated than just saying the word God, since the commandment referred to bearing witness to other gods in the above combination, the word implied a minimalization of the love and respect demanded in the Bible. The catch was that by the mid-19th century, these challenges of traditional ethics, uh, whose predecessors had declared the death of God, no longer believed. So the restrictions against expressions involving the word God had been abandoned. What was worse, their rejection of God and religion opened the floodgate for the misuse of words. Pretty soon, comedians like Lenny Bruce, who obliquely alluded to banished words and ideas, much to the pleasure of his listeners, became popular. He gained notoriety because authorities began to challenge his right to speak freely on stage, even though he never even said words like damn. He was funny and imaginative, especially in parodying his hypocritics, a simplification befitting his style. What he didn't know nor lived long enough to see was that he was soon to be outflanked by comedians far less circumspect in their word usage. The 60s had begun, and with them the total breakdown of speech barriers. Soon, comedians who used curse words or restricted language in limited private club settings because of court cases were uninhibited in their choice of words. It didn't take long before the restrictions were dropped even further, sometimes on TV shows which before had been off limits to such language. Thus, leaving out a lot of intermediate steps, we arrive at today when there seems to be no more restrictions on word usage, especially not on social media. For some, the F word is merely an adjective appended to any noun, and then outright blaspheming is not out of bounds. Especially to the growing number of atheists who proudly assert their anti-religion, challenging those who still safeguard their Christian, Jewish, Muslim, or other beliefs. But one taboo has been rejuvenated in a new form. The use of the word nigger is strictly limited to blacks. If a white man or woman utters the word in any form, he's not just vilified, but possibly subject to legal action. The history of this word is a long and complicated one. It is derived from the Spanish negro, meaning black, and probably became so ubiquitous because many of the early slave traders were Spanish and Portuguese, which language also uses that word. In the 18th and 19th centuries, until after the Civil War, the word Negro, or the more pejorative term nigger, was universally used in the English-speaking world. The pejorative implications of the word nigger were not generally acknowledged, and as a result, most people were not aware of them. This was most evident in the use of the word in Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn, which identified one of its main characters, Jim, using that term throughout the book. Anyone who has read the book and understood its message knows that Mark Twain, or Samuel L. Clemens, was the most ardent opponent of slavery and well ahead of his time in his attitude about the equality of the races in America. The story may be continued with other famous titles like Joseph Conrad's The Nigger of the Narcissus, which had no undertones of racism, contrary to what some uninformed modern-day critics may propose. Those who have read enough of Conrad's works can attest to his abhorrence of colonial ideas of supremacy and his depiction of the failures of European civilizers throughout the world. Back to the weird distinction in the way this word nigger is used today. When many years ago I started to teach in the Philadelphia public schools, most of whose students were either black or Puerto Rican, with a few scatterings of whites and later Asians, there was no doubt among the teachers and students about the prescription of this word. The principals, vice principals, and teachers of all backgrounds had adopted the attitude dominant after the war that this was a serious insult and should never be used. If any reference was made to members of an African background, they were at most to be called Negroes. Other non-Europeans were referred to as colored, which to my ear sounded absurd, as I used to point out that this implied I had no color in my skin. Despite these attitudes of the teachers and principals, even then many of the children used the word either in anger or with irony beyond their ken. I used to comment that in my experience, persecuted ostracized groups in Europe, particularly Jews, had never done this on a large scale. I had friends who many years after the Holocaust in private moments would use a term like kike or dirty Jew about one of their own who had done something deplorable to fellow Jews, but these were rare instances and certainly not used in front of children or taught to them. In fact, my friends would have strenuously objected if a child used these terms and would have gone out of his way to teach the child not to do so. Today, the situation is even more twisted. Only blacks use the term casually, but not the professionals or better situated ones. It is mostly those stuck in the ghettos, from which many are struggling to escape. There's one other successful group, black comedians. They use the term for the entertainment of audiences which are mostly not black. Thus, the people who are least likely to use the term in public, lest they be severely ostracized, if not punished, are laughing at a black man or woman using the term about his or her fellows. The psychology is what matters here. In an age when Western societies are attacked by the leftists leading the uninformed, those who are accused of the most malicious forms of racism are entertained by members of the supposedly persecuted group using a word associated with the institution that had persecuted their ancestors. The comedians are taking advantage of the lack of prohibitions in language use and are making money. They are not responsible for the first and are taking advantage of the second for the personal gain. The audience is another matter. What vicarious passions are satisfied? Is it just a matter of indulging in breaking a prohibition that has lost significance? Or is there some other, more nefarious impulse behind the entertainment? For some, the answer is probably indifference, since they harbor no more of these prejudices. But for the others who do not belong in that category, are their stereotypes substantiated? Whatever the case, there's something here, as in the use of words in general, that is expressed about the individual and possibly about the group. The psychology of the first is his or her problem, but the second is more complex, since it indicates something about groups in society. Their awareness and sensitivity are harder to establish, and worst of all, the consequences of their mindsets are harder to predict. Recently, reading C.G. Jung's analysis of the psychology of society, which, as Matthias Desmet, the Belgian psychologist, points out, could lead to mass psychosis, it is evident that large groups of people could be led to accepting some of the most horrific ideas. Ideas for which we have the evidence of the two greatest mass crimes of history, Nazism and communism. What is scary in our world today is that behind the use of words hides the ability to mislead large groups of people into following mad ideologies, that is, parodies of religion, which turn the originals into monsters or jokes. The last of these is what happens when a comedian parodies the essential morality that keeps society civilized. The other results in the sacrifice of millions of lives and the destruction of the civilization which produced that morality. With so many signs of the destruction of the civilization that had brought Western societies and much of the world to a point of prosperity, and well-being unimaginable even in the last century, this devaluation of words and disregard of their implications is a kind of message from the shared unconscious of humanity. We disregard it at our peril. That's it. Thank you. Again, it's A Citizen Speaks. I hope you liked what you heard. And if you do, click the like button. Even better, if you want to subscribe, do so and encourage me to continue. Thank you, and see you next time.